All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the Executive Director of Keras Circle. Keras Circle is a nonprofit programming arm of Keras Books, and Keras Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We are so excited to be here with all of you tonight to celebrate Creep, Accusations, and Confessions, brand new book from one of our favorite authors, Myriam Gurba, who is here tonight in conversation with one of our other favorite authors, Randa Jarrar. And tonight's event is part of a series that we are co-sponsoring with the Gay Johnson McDougall Center for Global Diversity and Inclusion at Agnes Scott College. This is Latinx Heritage Month, and so we are happy that this event happens to fall during that month. And we encourage any students who are watching with us to think about this event in the context of that month, whatever that means to you. Randa Jarrar is the author of the memoir Love is an Ex-Country, the novel A Map of Home, and the collection of stories Him, Me, Muhammad Ali. She is a filmmaker and actor who has appeared in independent films and on the A24 TV shows Rami and Number One Happy Family in USA. She is a recipient of a Creative Capital Award and an American Book Award, as well as awards and fellowships from the Lannan Foundation, Penn, and others. She lives in Los Angeles, California. And the person of the hour tonight is Myriam Gurba, who is a writer and artist. She is the author of the true crime memoir Mean, a New York Times editor's choice. Oh, the Oprah magazine ranked Mean as one of the best LGBTQ books of all time. Publishers Weekly describes Gurba as having a voice like no other. Her essays and criticism have appeared in the Paris Review, Time, and 4 columns. She has shown art in galleries, museums, and community centers, and she now lives in Pasadena, California. So I was saying in the green room, this is really like my dream event. This is the best part of being a bookseller and event planner, is that I get to just like match make my favorite conversations among people whose work I really admire. And so these two thinkers are really people whose work is always rigorous and honest. And this book, Creep, continues in that spirit of rigorous honesty, but also kindness. That's one of the things that I really admire about your work, and also humor. So I know that we will get into all of those things. Randa is also a hilarious writer and person. So talking about feminist humor, talking about queer humor, and what it means to use humor in the service of like telling the hard truth, I think is a really important and valuable thing. So thank you both so much for being with us. Everyone who's watching at home, if you'd like to ask questions, you can put them in the chat at any time, and we'll perhaps incorporate them into the conversation if there is time. So thank you both so much.
Hey, thank you for having us. Hi, Myriam.
Hi, Randa.
I'm so happy to be here with you and to chat with you about this new book. It's just absolutely brilliant. I hope that everybody everywhere reads it, because it's generous, as ER was saying, but also very exact and like just furious in its holding up of, violence for us to really look at the ways that it affects people, those who perpetrate it and those who are victims of it. Can you talk more generally, about why you wanted to write this book and where these essays really come from?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that introduction, Randa. And I'm so honored to be hosted by Keras, and I'm so honored to be in conversation with you, Randa, because you're such a dear friend and you're brilliant. So I began to think about the book that would become Creep after I escaped from an abuser. And on the night that I escaped from that abuser, I was sheltered at the home of two friends. So essentially, they had created a safe house situation for me. And my abuser tracked me to that home. He pursued me and tried to insinuate his way into the house where I was being protected. And one of my defenders worked very valiantly to kindly prevent this person from entering the home. And my abuser was so incredibly persistent that he wore down my defender, and my defender snapped and at one point screamed, "Get the fuck out of here, you are a creep." And hearing my abuser be named as such functioned for me as a sort of unmasking. So the naming was an unmasking. And to finally have him exposed like that in a public setting helped to break the abusive spell that he had wrought. And I really held on to that word, like the hollering of the word creep. And so what I wanted to do was sort of latch onto that word almost as like a verbal talisman and as a torch as well. And I wanted to use that word to sort of guide me toward freedom and guide me toward liberation. And so I began to conceive of writing various essays that would examine the figure of the creep, but also creep as a verb, and also examine what I refer to as like institutional creepdom. So the carceral state would fall under a category of institutional creepdom. So I would say that we could say that the book was conceived that evening, on the evening of my escape.
I love that. That's so great. It's true. Like when you're saying like hearing someone else name your abuser and really unmask him, I think that it's so difficult for me as someone who's also a victim to remember a time when I didn't see my abuser as such, right? Because of the things they do to kind of
Precisely.
put, just put everything on you, right? So yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I'm so glad this book came out of that, because in a way what you're doing is taking that kind of liberation and inviting everyone who reads it into liberation too. So yeah, I really love that about this book.
Thank you.
We had talked a little bit about humor, and here it's mixed with like murder, assault, fear, the unimaginable. There's a moment where someone, sticks their hand in someone's fontanelle, in a baby's fontanelle, and the next line is, "Can you imagine?" Which is, it has this kind of like humorous tone to it. So how do you do it, and why do you do it?
So I live at the intersection of humor and horror. It's where I'm most comfortable.
Yeah.
And
I love
so
that.
that's sort of like the crossroads that I inhabit. And to spend time with me and to spend time with my work is to walk yourself to that crossroads too, and to spend time there. And humor has been a tool that I've used throughout my life in order to self-soothe, but also in order to survive. And so when I write, I do often focus on very, very difficult subjects, and those subjects often involve and center violence. And when readers approach those sorts of narratives, that type of prose, that violence can be very constricting, and with that constriction can come almost like a suffocation, right? Where the breath sort of gets caught and it's held. And I know that often if I'm in a panic or I'm experiencing like some similar mood state, I forget to breathe. And so the humor in part is intended to return the breath to the reader. So I'm considering like my sort of physical state as I'm writing, but I'm also considering the effect that the prose is going to have on the reader. And so I'm considering that lack of breath, and then how to, once again, encourage the reader to inhale and exhale, and laughter is one way of achieving that. And so it's almost as if I'm offering sips of water. I'm offering sips of oxygen through this very sort of carefully timed humor.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, it's so generous and it works. I think it really works. But I think it also does this really weird and cool thing where it just highlights, it's like that intersection you're talking about, horror and humor. It really highlights the absurdity of violence, right? Like the just the multi-layered absurdities. Um, there's a section in here where you talk about, you write about the Nightcrawler, a serial killer who was very active in mostly Southern California. But you also tie his activities with, you explain his past to us in a way that doesn't exonerate him at all, but in fact shows us the ways that he was raised by people who are even more monstrous, and how we don't see those people as monstrous. Can you talk more about the specifics of that, but also your intentions there and the research you did for this book?
Absolutely. So the essay Kukui features several individuals who can be thought of as these sort of classic villains, these classically profoundly evil creeps. And the essay opens with the figure of Ernesto Miranda. Ernesto Miranda was a serial rapist who became notorious as a result of his involvement in a landmark Supreme Court case that yielded the Miranda warning. And then I link his history to the history of Richard Ramirez, who was a serial killer active in California and who was dubbed the Night Stalker. And then I connect his history to the history of a little known perpetrator who sexually assaulted me when I was 19 years old. And he was also a serial perpetrator and went on to actually take the life of one of his victims. And so that essay was one in which I was comparing so-called monsters and demonstrating that while Richard Ramirez is elevated as this notorious monster because of his body count, he was trained to kill by a former Green Beret. And that Green Beret had a higher body count than the cousin he trained. But because that Green Beret was killing in the name of empire, he's a hero. And when he returned from Vietnam, that Green Beret went on to commit a femicide. He went on to execute his wife in front of his cousin Richard. And so I am arguing that if we want to hold systems responsible for what Richard Ramirez became, we need to examine empire and we need to examine misogyny. Because what he did is not the result of a unique psychological defect. The training was provided by the US Army. And the training was provided by misogyny. And Richard's father had been a policeman in Mexico. who had been a firearms trainer. So again, we have all these different systems and structures conspiring to create this being. And one of the Ramirez, or actually several of the Ramirez killings happened in Whittier, which also happens to be the town where one of my grandmothers lived. And she's buried in the cemetery in Whittier. And a 2 or 3 minute walk from her grave will take you to the graves of 2 of Richard Ramirez's victims. And so they're all resting in this cemetery together. And I did visit their graves when I was writing this book. And I did ask for permission to write about those victims. So when I could, I actually visited specific locales that are featured in the book.
I love that. Yeah. There's an extensive citation section of sources in the book, which I find very rare in literary nonfiction published these days, right? So can you like talk to us and kind of guide us through your research process for the book?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I come from history nerds. My dad is a major history nerd, and I inherited that from him. And so for me, my entry point into a lot of work tends to be like a historical window or a historical doorway. So what I will do is I will approach personal history as macro history as opposed to micro history, because history didn't start with me. And so what I do is I tend to like survey the literature first and then find where I and my subjects are going to be located within that. And so when I was working on Creep, the pandemic had just begun. And so quite a bit of my research was done digitally. So I was worming through a lot of digital archives, but I was also visiting specific locations that I write about and conducting interviews. So I write a lot about specific family members in the book. And in some ways, I think it's a little misleading to describe Creep as personal history, because I think in many ways it's more of a family history rather than a personal history. And it's seen as personal because I'm the narrator, but I'm often not narrating my own circumstances. I'm often narrating the circumstances of others. And so I conducted interviews with various family members. In particular, I spent a lot of time interviewing my mother, interviewing my father, and then interviewing my cousin Desiree.
Okay. Yeah. Can we talk? Okay, I'd love to talk about Desiree and the essay about Desiree, because it's just Locas. It's such a strong, powerful sort of appeal to basically, shut down prisons and
Yes.
end incarceration. That's
Very much a fun essay.
Yeah. And the way that you position Desiree, as the daughter of Petra, right?
Yes.
Is that her mom? Yeah. And like how Petra's obsessed with Barbies, and just the way that you really give details into how Desiree became, a gang member, and then later, and often, intertwined there, like a felon. Can you talk a little about the essay, how you came to approach it, what Desiree thinks of it, etc.?
Absolutely. So the essay Locas is different from the rest of the essays in the collection because it is the only one that was commissioned by a family member. And I'll explain how that came about. So Locas is about my cousin Desiree, and it centers her. And I also explain my very unique relationship to my cousin. So my cousin contacted me around the time that I began working on Creep. And essentially what she proposed to me is this. She said that she was very unhappy and bothered by how she exists in the criminal legal archive, that she is a criminalized Latina, that she is she has this legacy as a felon, and the crime reporters who have also written about her have only focused on sort of the most narrow aspect of her existence. And she wanted to be humanized, she wanted her dignity returned, and more explicitly, what she requested was an explanation to readers of how a female gangster is made. So she tasked me with explaining that female gangsters are not born, female gangsters are manufactured by the United States of America and its carceral system. And female gangsters are also largely manufactured by child abuse, in particular child sexual abuse. And so when my cousin came to me and made this request, there was no way in hell that I could deny that request, because when we were 13 years old, she had already been jumped into a gang. I did not know this. And her family, her mother did not know this. And so her mother had sent us away from Whittier. Her mother had sent her away from Whittier and had sent her to Santa Maria to sort of detoxify from the sort of criminality that she seemed to be embracing. And I was sort of paired with her in order to sort of imbue her with this sort of California girlishness, but it didn't quite work out that way. Instead, what Desiree started to do was mentor me in gangsterism. And so she kind of adopted me as the little homie, and we formed our own gang. It was a 2-girl gang, and we called ourselves Pocas Pero Locas, which means the few but insane. And we threw PPL gang signs. I learned like gang calligraphy, and I've never been jumped out of PPL. I'm still in it. And so when La Green Eyes came to me and told me that this was my task, I'm still loyal to this enterprise that we embarked upon as 13-year-olds. And so of course I said, hell yeah. And then we co-wrote that essay in a sense, because I charged my cousin with compiling documents for me so that I could sift through various primary sources. And then we also did a series of interviews. And then as I developed drafts of the Locas essay, I would send them off to Desiree, and she would give me the thumbs up or the thumbs down. So it was a co-cousin project. Oh, you're muted.
Said I love it, and there's a line in here early in the essay where you say she remembered things she was supposed to keep secret, things that we're now going to set free. And I feel like that is that is like a sentence that, you know, can just be an intro to this entire collection, right? Like, can you talk more about like this, you know, what it does to uncover all of this, what it does to set things right or to set narratives free?
Absolutely. So, one of the conversations that Desi and I had was about burdens, that she felt for a very long time that she was carrying these heavy sacks, and they were weighing her down. They were weighing down her movement, and the sacks were filled with skeletons. And she wanted not just the ability to set the bone-filled sacks down. She wanted us to take out the bones and kind of inventory them, right? Bone by bone. And so creep is sort of this process of doing that. And in the case of my cousin, what we wanted to do was expose the child sexual abuse that she had experienced, because that was one of those skeletons. And that sort of truth-telling project links all of the essays. And I'll give a few examples of how that manifests in various essays. I have an essay where I invoke Lorena Leonor Gallo, who became notorious under her married name Lorena Bobbitt. I invoke her as a folk saint who can be appealed to by battered women. And I took a lot of care in drafting that essay because so often the self-defense that she engaged in has been misrepresented and minimized. And marital rape is often glossed over as part of her story. And so I wanted to center marital rape and intimate partner rape. And so in that sense, again, I'm trying to engage in truth-telling, and I'm also sharing the observations that I made during adolescence when she was being tried. I remember that there are so many boys and so many men who, for whom the notion of a man raping his wife did not compute. I remember hearing so many boys and men saying, I don't understand how that can happen. And the implication is that a man can do whatever he wants with an intimate partner, that she's a disposable being, right? And so again, what I'm doing as well is exposing these truths that I witnessed in response to that story during adolescence. In the final essay, I do much of the same. I chronicle my experience of IPV, and I do it very graphically and in this very explicit way. And the reason that I chose to do it in such a way is that when I was first beginning to internally acknowledge to myself that I was experiencing IPV, I began to look for reflections of what I was going through on the page. And I wasn't finding many of them in the realm of nonfiction. And what I did find in nonfiction tended to be very short and very clipped. So for example, we would get sort of like a bird's eye view of an experience, or we would get sort of a window into an experience. But rarely was I reading a chronicle that traced the experience of entrapment from start to finish and ending with escape. And also, I didn't find very many detailed descriptions of sexual violence being perpetrated within intimate partner relationships. And so I wanted to be very honest about what intimate partner rape looks like. And I wanted to offer that to readers because until I saw that reality on the page, it was very, very, very difficult for me to name what was happening to me.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Is there or what was your reason for ending the book with that essay?
So my reason for ending the book with that essay was manifold. And one of the primary reason is that when I was sharing the essay with readers, they indicated that they struggled a lot with it. In particular, readers who know me or readers who love me, they found it very, very challenging. And what I began to think was that if I were to have placed this essay at the very beginning, it would have cast such a difficult shadow across the rest of the essays that perhaps people wouldn't even have even wanted to touch them. And so what I did instead was organize the essays in such a way where I'm gently guiding the reader toward that final chronicle. And in that final chronicle, I invoke a metaphor that is the fog. And so what I hope is understood is that I'm inviting readers into that fog from the first essay. And I'm serving as a guide through that fog. I didn't have a guide when I became trapped in the fog, but I'm here functioning in that manner as a narrative guide. Sort of like Orpheus guiding Eurydice, who I invoke in the final essay. And And so I'm gently taking the reader there. And by the time the reader gets there, they've become very intimate with me and with my world. And I think are much more open to the receipt of an essay of this nature.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think it's, again, I keep saying it's generous, but it is so generous of you as a writer to be like, okay, we're going to get to, you know, my creep. Well, there's many creeps, but we're going to get to my creep. But first, I'm going to show you all of the ways that we can look at creeps and all of the ways these creeps creep into our culture, into our beds, into our minds, into our bodies. And we're going to do it very slowly. And I'm going to so generously show you all the different ways that society excuses them, creates them, all of that. And then we're going to get to my creep. And I think that that's, yeah, I found it to be really powerful. Yeah, I just was curious about how you would explain it, but yeah, the fog and the idea of you saying I didn't have this kind of guidance. So you're not just doing it for us, you're doing it for like little Myriam and older Myriam too. You're doing it for yourself, and you're showing the reader ways that she can do it for herself too. I think that that's, and you're showing that it's work. You're showing that this isn't easy. This is not easy. This is this process of like decolonizing the self and really, really interrogating the ways we've internalized misogyny. We've internalized all of these things. It's kind of like that line in the Desiree essay, like, let's take all of this shit and like, let's really look at it. Let's take it out into the open and examine it. But yeah, in so many ways, this book is a huge gift to readers. And we're so lucky that you did all of this work really to kind of dress these wounds and show us a way to go in and do that with our own narratives and our family's narratives. That was another thing about this book, is like how deeply connected you make all of these stories and sew all these stories with your family histories. And you know, you talk about, you've already told us you're a history nerd, but in the book you also talk about how you wanted to study history because you and your people were so often kept out of history books, especially in this country, right? So do you want to talk about history just a little bit more, and the ways that maybe some surprises you had while you were writing this, or yeah, something you thought would be simple that ended up not, any of that?
Sure. So I think, like, you know, there are multiple threads that I used to try to stitch the essays together. And so family history is one of those very sort of bright threads that appears and reappears. And I pull quite a bit from primary sources, and I even like collage using primary sources. I did that with my memoir Mean. Mean is very heavily collaged. And I did the same with Creep. Like, for example, in the final essay, I use my hospital records and my medical records from the injuries that I sustained as a result of IPV. I collage those in to give the reader a sense of medical history. So I'm providing the readers with various historical documents that the reader can interpret and then sift through. One of the surprises that did happen when I was working on some of the essays was encountering information about my grandfather's ancestry that had not been shared with me. So as I was going through archival documents, I began to see that up on document after document, my maternal grandfather and his ancestors had been racialized as indigenous, and that was not ever anything that my grandfather discussed. In fact, like, my grandfather was a very devoted Mexican nationalist, and therefore very devoted to the notion of mestizaje, which is sort of, you could say, the racial hegemony that that exists in Mexico, politically, socially, culturally, across the board. And so to encounter that on paper was surprising. And then as I began to ask questions of family members, given the undeniability of this phenomenon, because it was on paper, there was more forthrightness and information that was at last shared with me that had been kind of occulted from me for a very, very long time because of internalized anti-indigeneity that is prevalent, throughout the Americas. And so excavating that, for lack of a better word, was like one of the more surprising aspects of the historical research.
That. I also, by the way, I love the way you write about your vain grandmother.
Oh yeah.
So real. I feel like every brown person has this vain maternal, entity. It's like, yes, she's real, but there's an entity-ness to her as a character. And the way that a lot of it is just internalized anti-Blackness as well, right? Just like
Absolutely.
fear of living and being found out, or whatever it is, right? And not passing.
Absolutely. Yeah. My grandmother prided herself very much on having just extremely pale skin and green eyes. And her grandmother had been a Black Mexican woman. And my grandmother was absolutely obsessed with not ever being read as a Black woman, and obsessed with her children never being identified as Afro descendants. And so there's this myth that has circulated in our family for years that we have this French ancestry, and that French sort of intervention into our family happened as a result of the French occupation of Mexico. And it's funny because there's even the fictional Frenchman has been named. And so I've done research into this fictional Frenchman, and this fictional Frenchman is an indigenous man.
I love it.
He's a Frenchman who's indigenous to the Cocula region of Mexico.
It's a very French region.
Extremely French.
It's so Francais.
We do all kinds of French things there. Yeah.
That's
so yeah. So it was just so it was gleeful to find the truth and to be able to provide this truthful counter narrative to these anti-Black and anti-indigenous to this anti-Black and anti-indigenous lore that I was socialized into.
Yeah. Very relatable. There's a moment, well, not maybe a moment, but you, speaking of the truth, you wanted also, when you were writing about your grandpa, you were like, this is my grandpa as he was. Like, this is not lore. I'm going to take that lore but I want to show where I come from, like as these people as they actually were, which I think is really rare
Yeah.
for us as writers, because for me as a Palestinian, so much of what we write about when we write about our grandparents is like blindly adoring, right?
Yeah.
It's just like, you adore, you love, you exalt, but you never sort of show people as they were. You never,
Yep.
right? Because of all the violence that they're going
Yes.
through. But what I love about this book is that it says, no, you can do that and also name this bigger violence.
Absolutely. Yeah. So often when people pass, we reissue their life story as hagiography. And I don't want to do that. I don't think any of us really deserves hagiography, not even the saints. And so what I wanted to do was develop like a style of writing that is an anti-tribute. And so it's both tribute and takedown simultaneously, which I think is the ideal way of humanizing a figure, right? And so my treatment of my grandfather is one in which I do honor him. I do bring him his flowers. And I do believe that without his influence in my life, it's unlikely that I would have developed the incredible affection that I have for Mexican literature. And he was a poet and he was a publicist. He also did some journalism. And I do think that having had a grandparent who was involved with those vocations and those professions had an influence on me. It absolutely did, because it normalized writing for me. It made me believe that like I could potentially have a life on the page. However, my grandfather was also intensely misogynistic, right? And he was proud of his misogyny. And his misogyny in some ways became an obstacle for me. My grandfather once said that women do not have the ability to be great writers because we're such virtuous creatures. And in order to be a literary genius, a person needs to lead a life of vice. And so what I'm attempting to do through Creep is to show my grandfather my lack of virtue. And also, ironically, make one of his dreams come true, because my grandfather was incredibly vain. He was not just a dandy. He was like a hyper dandy. Like he wore a starched collar every day if he left the house. Like at home, he was wearing huaraches and like very plain clothes. But when he left the house, he had his pocket square. He had a starched collar, the whole 9 yards. He really aspired to become the poet laureate of Mexico, and he really wanted to become the poet laureate of Guadalajara, which never happened. And so he wanted his name in people's mouths. And so I gave him what he wanted. His name is now going to be in people's mouths, but because of a woman, because of his granddaughter. So
I love that. I love that.
Thank you.
What I think we are nearing towards the end, but I wanted to know what you really hope people get out of Creep. Like, what is it if you know what I mean? Like, what do you want people to walk away with when they finish reading this?
So I hope that people get what they need from the text. And I did write it very much with survivors in mind, in particular, people who are in the thick of it, who need to see themselves on the page and who need to see specific language used to describe their specific predicament. I'm inviting them now to use that language to self-describe. And so that was sort of like my chief desire. But I also hope that the book encourages people to like consider their location in creepdom, because we all have like a little creep inside of us and we all have creep potential, right? And so I hope that people interrogate their place in these cultures, because these institutions that we battle are nothing if not just collections of people, right? They function almost like slime molds. So what is your creepy role in the slime molds? That's sort of what I'm hoping that people will ask themselves, and that they'll attempt to answer it and then take action.
Fuck yes. Myriam, thank you. You wrote this book. You brought yourself as an educator. You brought yourself as a poet. You brought yourself as a queer, and all of these ways intersectionally to create just a fucking brilliant work of art that I hope, you know, everybody reads. It should become, well, it'll probably get banned at some point, but it should be, it should be required reading. Yes, yes. There is one question. Someone wants to know how long your passion has been to communicate with others, in hopes that sharing your experiences will empower other women.
So as far as like communicating with others, I've always been hyper communicative. In other words, like I was that kid who in elementary school had to consistently be moved because I talk so fucking much. Do you know what I mean? And
I love that. Yes.
And the thing is like I remember there was a teacher who was like, aha, I know what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna put her next to people who can't speak English. I was like, bitch, I'm bilingual. Like I can make friends wherever I go. So like I've always had a penchant for externalizing my interiority, but when it comes to sharing experiences that empower women, I'm not interested in the general empowerment of women. I'm interested in very specific forms of empowerment, because women can be assholes too. You know what I mean? So
That's true.
I would say, like, for most of my adult life, there's been different degrees of commitment to that. For example, like my first job in publishing was as an editorial assistant at On Our Backs, which is the first lesbian pornographic magazine produced by lesbians for lesbians. I mean, talk about empowering women, right? So thank you. So like, yeah. I would say like to different degrees my whole life. Yeah.
I love that. Have there been any questions that journalists or people you've been in conversation with haven't asked? Anything that you kind of wish people asked you about the writing of this book or the contents of this book?
There have been, let's see, there have been some essays that people have been much more interested in discussing than others. And
I didn't bring up that essay on purpose.
My editor really enjoyed the essay Waterloo, and not a single person has talked to me about that essay, and I find it really strange that nobody has touched on that essay. And that is an essay that is about my experiences visiting Iowa, and experiences of racism and xenophobia in Iowa, but also hopefulness in the midst of that racism and xenophobia, especially like hopefulness as exhibited by very young people. So that's I'm surprised that is an essay that people have ignored, but maybe now that I'm mentioning it, They're
Yeah.
all more interested in it.
Do you think that, I wonder if it's connected to like sort of like the way that you are an outsider there viewing whiteness from that perspective, and that
Yeah,
might be why?
yeah, it could be that. And I think that like I think that's the essay where I implicate I I describe sort of like the nice racism of the Midwest. And I think that a lot of people find that really troublesome. And so they would rather
Yeah.
not touch it
Yeah.
because it tarnishes certain myths about the heartland.
Yeah. I love the way that you talk about like how being away from the Pacific and being away from that edge sort of the country showed you like how much you miss it and maybe take it for granted or need it, and how weird it is to be in a place that's like landlocked like that.
Yes. Yes. Like I had to have incredible distance from California to understand not necessarily how meaningful California was to me because I've always had um like an extremely passionate relationship with California. Even as a child, I was really enthusiastic about where I lived. Like I remember inhaling the scent of California like after it would rain and surreptitiously like sticking dirt in my mouth because it smelled so good. I figured it would taste just as good. You know what I mean? I was like, I want to eat California. So like
Yeah,
it was when I finally got to Iowa that I realized how important the Pacific Ocean is to me. And that not having it there felt like not having an escape hatch. And it horrified me, like the flatness horrified me, and like the infinite horizon was it felt like a threat. like infinite land just felt like a threat to me. So yeah, it was that absence that really demonstrated for me how much having been raised along the coast was of significance to shaping me.
absolutely. And it also shows the ways that like, it's still considered in the US, going to Iowa for an MFA is considered like, the only prestigious way to, attain, I don't know, some sort of critical success as a writer or something when
Totally. And it's so funny because like I feel like my MFA was going to Iowa and observing, you know what I mean?
yeah.
And then journaling about what I would see. And there was a summer that I actually did find myself in Ames. And I remember looking around like wondering, is that a writer? Is that a writer? Is that a writer? And and the high point of my visit to Ames was having lunch at Culver's. We had a really nice Butterburger
That sounds amazing.
and some custard. Yeah. So I've been to Ames, but not
Like,
in the capacity of like study. It was for lunch.
yeah, perfect. Um, so one of the questions here is, can you talk about your Didion essay? It's so good. Why do you think so few people have ever tried to think critically about Didion? Talk about hagiography.
Yeah, exactly. Like I think that she she's the ice queen, right? She has been made and manufactured into a legend. And New York loves Didion. And when New York loves a figure, the rest of us are not allowed to shoot an arrow at them, right? We're not allowed to touch them. We're not allowed to taint them. And and Didion, to an extent, can represent a certain California, but there is a California that exists alongside hers that she could not see. She was incapable of seeing it because those are the gears, right? That California is made up of the gears that enabled her California to exist. And what I'm referring to is the labor force that fueled Didion's career, right?
Yeah.
I mean, consider the domestic workers she had, the childcare that she experienced, the translator who she relied on when she wrote a book about El Salvador. Like, she didn't speak Spanish, so she has relied on racialized labor, and this vision of California, this canonical vision of California that she has created, would have been impossible without Mexican and Mexican American and Central American labor.
Yeah. Yeah. I think also she's it's just so easy to hold on to her as like the chronicler of California, right?
Yes,
There's a laziness, there's like a cultural
absolutely.
laziness, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. And then there's also, I think, a preoccupation with her personal style, right? Like, she's elevated and she's this like chic figure as well. And so people are very sort of invested with or invested in sort of embodying that chicness themselves.
Yeah. And the chicness is like very much in line with, you know, colonial misogynist white ideals of beauty, right? Like, I'm sure there were other writers that were writing about California who, you know, yeah, everyone wants a little black dress and a Corvette. That's real.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And also, I think her extreme thinness is a part of it too.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a huge part of it. Yeah.
And yeah, and I remember seeing like somebody tweet some time ago about Didion likely having had an eating disorder, and she was torn apart by Twitter for making that suggestion. And it's like,
Twitter has so much time. So much time to talk about people's opinions. Just they're just so happy to. It's wild. I'm curious how long that's gonna last. Now that Twitter has become X. Speaking of creeps.
Right? Like,
so creepy.
Yeah. I mean, he bought it because he's petulant about having a transgender kid. You know what I mean? Like, that's why he bought Twitter.
Can you imagine what else he could have done, like, for trans kids?
But this is
with that money. Yeah.
Yeah. It's horrific. It's disgusting.
It really is horrific and so sad. Protect trans kids at all costs, truly. Yeah. Yeah. Myriam. This was so much fun. I really enjoyed this. Thank you. Thank you for writing this book. And
my pleasure.
Yeah, just the care with which you constructed the essays, and the order. I love the way they're ordered. I love that the Didion essay is kind of like right in the center. You know, like it's the white onion that we kind of like, you know, we depart from there, right? In this really cool way. Yeah. So wait, you posted something today on Instagram about the book which shall not be named. Just someone like, you're like, how are you still attacking me when this book is still considered like a
so it's Latina Heritage Month, right? Otherwise known as Hispanic Heritage Month, otherwise known as Latinx Heritage Month, etc., etc. And so during this month, that we are somewhat seen and acknowledged, there tend to be these book roundups, right? Where it's suggested how readers might get to know this community. And that book is again appearing on lists, and it's so hugely ironic, because I remember a couple of weeks ago, Publishers Marketplace described me as the person who canceled that book. How did I do that? Because it's a bestseller.
Yeah, it's very interesting, the illogical ways that, you know, people who usually have no power are kind of blamed for things that just aren't happening. Like, how is one person critiquing a book? How is one person who isn't, like, you don't own the Hearst building, like, you're not
right
Murdoch, like, what is happening that you're like, how are you canceling a book
so
by critiquing
bizarre. It's such an exercise in absurdity. Like,
it is
on the one hand, I have been accused of being the person who made that book a bestseller. And on the other hand, I'm also the person who canceled it. Which one am I? And also, that's a lot of power. If I had that much power, I wouldn't be using it to do that. Do you know what I mean? Like, I would be using it in other ways. But I'm powerless in every way, except when I wave my magic Mexican wand, I'm able to cancel this one book, or I'm able to make a bestseller. But somehow I can't do the same for my own book or anybody else's book, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
So it's just, sometimes you just gotta laugh.
Yeah.
I just have to laugh at all of my fictional power.
Yeah. And that's what I was talking about earlier, with the way that you are able to sort of talk about violence and the absurdities around it and the humor around it by asking these questions. Like, how is it possible to be supposedly this powerful? Yeah, it's very simple, the kind of like hatred that gets directed at people who are not white cis men and have an opinion. Like, it's really just very basic. If you have an opinion and you voice it, it's sort of like, how dare you? How dare we have these opinions?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there was another accusation against me. The accusation was that Myriam made up her experience of domestic violence, and she's doing that so that she can sell books. And it's like, let's look at women who have disclosed that they are survivors and the effect that that's had on their careers. Also, talk about a bizarre long game. Like, I've never spoken to anybody in publicity and marketing who said, you know what you should really do?
It's true.
You should fabricate a story of domestic violence because it's going to be great for book sales. Hell no. Like, come on. People who are victimized are people who experience the least compassion. Compassion is typically reserved for power.
Yeah. And there's so much, like we were saying before we went live, there's so much money in protecting those who are in power and kind of like leading and bringing compassion to them, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, the way W. Bush has been rehabilitated, the fact that Dick Cheney is just like running around, I mean, not in jail, right?
Yeah.
It's just wild.
I mean, the way that most rapists, that like 99.9% of them are living their best lives.
Yeah.
freely roaming, the planet, like they are protected.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, no, it is really, really wild, sort of the misperceptions and the misrepresentations that dominate understandings of perpetration versus victimization are so mind-boggling.
Yeah. Truly. Yeah, it's always wild to me when I'm like, oh, so people think that it's fun to just pretend and it's lucrative to pretend to be victimized. It's like,
That's the weirdest part, is the belief that there's somehow monetary reward in it. And like the reality is that I remember reading half of the unhoused population in LA County are domestic violence survivors. It's not lucrative to survive
no,
violence. Like
no.
nobody is hiring us. Like one of the best ways to lose your job is to disclose that you are a DV victim at work.
Yeah.
Like that is a great path toward getting pushed out of your workplace.
Yeah. I mean, and that's what you get for just not getting killed. Like that's really
Exactly.
like the
Exactly.
society we live in rewards rewards, abusers so well that it's like
Oh,
even if
absolutely.
you don't, even if you somehow survive, right? You're
Mhm.
you're not, it's not going to be easy to find a place to live or to find a job. So how much longer will you survive is always the question,
Mhm.
right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's infuriating. Truly. Yeah.
Are there more questions?
I was looking, I don't see any. If you have any questions, please share them now, immediately.
See that there's one question in the question area. He answered it. Okay, and now that question has disappeared because it was answered.
Yay. There's one, do you think it's more difficult for people to get up in arms about daily personal racist attacks than it is the larger offenses?
Absolutely. I think it's much easier for people to get angry at individuals than it is to get angry at systems, because then people have a scapegoat, and scapegoats can make life really easy. So yes, if oppression is a personal moral failing, then all we need is self-help as opposed to political revolution. And so with creep, like one of the intents that I had in mind was to like pair sort of personal narrative with sociological storytelling, because so often when stories like mine are shared, they sort of hyper focus on the individual or a set of individuals. And I really wanted to expand my lens and demonstrate how structures collude, and how
Yeah.
without structural change, not necessarily reform, but I think revolution, we're not going to see significant and lasting change.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's just getting harder and harder um, to even imagine what that revolution would look like. But oh, is this perhaps why the essay was overlooked? Is another question.
Which is it?
The very last line in the chat, is this why the essay Waterloo was overlooked? Possibly.
It could be. I don't know. I think it's odd that like that essay hasn't that it hasn't really grabbed people the way the way other essays have. But maybe it's like a sleeper essay. You know what I mean? Like it's hibernating and then it's
I
going to do
think
its
it
work.
is. And I also think that, I mean, I'm not sure, and I don't want to make assumptions about audiences, right? But sometimes I wonder if, you know, writing about whiteness, right? Um, that's like something that isn't in our lane or something, right? So we are kind of punished by a lack of engagement with that kind of writing. But I'm not sure,
Like, do you
like
mean in terms of critiquing it that we're not supposed
mm,
to do that?
that the way that once it's connected to place, especially, right?
Ah, I see. Okay.
And I love how earlier in the book you talk about, well, I was being taught about Winesburg, Ohio, you know? I was like,
Yeah.
"What?" I was like, "Oh no, I read that book,"
Right?
Um,
Like it's like that
yeah,
book, like it appeared like again and again and again. And so, you have this vision of what that region might be like as a result of being introduced to it through literature. But I remember, like, when I first started visiting the Midwest, I felt like I was visiting a foreign country. It was so different to me. Like, geographically, it was so different, but culturally too. And I did not feel welcomed. I really did not feel welcomed. I felt as if like people were giving me these very, very overly saccharine smiles, like, hi, you know what I mean? And it was creepy
mm,
because I was like, I know that that's an insincere smile and I'm not sure what it's masking. And so, yeah. And so that niceness inspired like a lot of like dis-ease. You know what I mean? I was just so apprehensive. And then slowly, as I started hearing commentary in private, I was like, oh, okay, I know what's happening. My intuition was correct. So, yeah.
yeah. I lived in Michigan for 3 years, and I always say, like, it was such a wild time in my life that, like, I actually ended up marrying a white cis man, like like a straight white cis man, because I was just like, "How am I gonna survive this space?" Like, it's just, um
You
yeah, I
tried to
just
marry
can't.
into it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was
Like,
like, I maybe, and I like really think of him as like a sweater from that time because I was like just so cold. The Midwest is so cold in terms of like people's attitudes and
yeah.
the way the topography and the geography actually informs, um, you know, the ways that people treat each other, and the very deep, uh, like forms of segregation there. But yeah, it was really rough. It was, like, such a rough time. Uh,
Oh, that's
yeah, so I can relate.
Yeah, so I used to go regularly and I would tell people like when they would ask me what my summer plans were, I would tell people that I was going abroad and then they would say where and I'd go Iowa. Cuz like I'm taking my passport. Like it's another country.
It
Like
is. It
I
really
get
is.
it. I don't get it. And then there was an experience that I didn't write about, but that occurred at a diner in a very, very, very small town. It was a town of like maybe 1,000. I had gone to actually it wasn't a diner, it was a cafe, right? It was the only cafe in town. It was like they had one main street, right? So I go to the only cafe in town and I had wanted to go there to write. So, like, I had brought my materials to write, and I was gonna, buy like a pastry and a coffee and just sit. And so I enter the cafe, and the proprietor was there, the woman who owned it. She's behind the counter, and so there was like a bell on the door that jingled when I entered. So I walk inside, and then she came out to look at me. She looked me up and down, made a face, and then walked into the kitchen and she wouldn't serve me. And I don't know why. Like, I'm not sure what it was. I don't know if she read me as queer and it was like a homophobic response. I don't know if she was racializing me in some way, so it was a racist response. I don't know if it was just general xenophobia, like, you're not from here, so I'm not going to serve you. I don't know what it was, but the lady looked me up and down and refused to serve me. And then I confided in others from that town about what had happened, and they're like, "Oh yeah, she's just, that's just how she is." And I was like, "Well, has she ever done that to you?" And they're like, "No." And I was like, "Okay, then that's just not how she is." Like, this lady has a fucking problem with certain categories of people to which I belong, and I don't know what that category is, but clearly I belong in that bucket of people who she will not serve cookies to.
Wow.
Yeah.
I really want us to Yelp review this place. Not that a lot of people are going anyway. Yelp bomb. Yeah.
Yeah.
Truly just bizarre behavior. And
Really? Like, I was just like, oh my God. Like, she doesn't even want my money. Like, that's how triggered this lady is. She doesn't even want to touch my money,
yeah, you're like, that's fine. I could just sit here for free.
Right? Oh my God. I was a little scared though.
No, it's not safe. Yeah, it's not safe.
I'm gonna go hide. I'm gonna go hide behind the corn silo. Like,
yeah, the corn silo is the only place. Where else are you gonna go?
Yeah. So that was the hospitality that I received.
Do you want to? I would be interested in hearing about your kind of like day-to-day routine while you were putting this book together, while you were writing the book and editing it, etc. I feel like we don't talk about, a lot of people will be like, do you write with a pen or with a laptop? I'm like, no. Tell me what your day-to-day, like
okay.
what, yeah.
Yeah. So, this book was written really differently, in contrast with like all my previous books. And, I had I had some distress around the process because, I knew that it was going to be really, really difficult to write the title essay. And so I had to have the title essay ready before I embarked on the rest of it. And so when I worked on that essay, I worked on it daily, and it took me about a year to get it in the sort of shape that it needed to be in. And then I also engaged in certain spiritual practices that melded with my writing practice. And I engaged in those spiritual practices for the sake of self-care, but also to invite like ancestral spirits and other spirits to participate in the writing process. And that required me to spend quite a bit of time at various altars that I have organized around my home. And the altars that I spent the most time with, or the shrines that I spent the most time with, are one that I have that honors female spirits and deities. Another one that honors my ancestors, and then one that I keep behind my door that is for El Legua, who is the keeper of the crossroads. And so I spent time making offerings and also meditating and making appeals at these various altars. And so And so there was like a daily spiritual component that required altar work. And I also had to recover at times from certain places where I was going in order to do this writing. So doing this sort of writing requires diving into the abyss, and then when you return from the abyss, there's like a disorientation, right? And so in order to kind of return to my body and be in my body again, I had to completely kind of detach from the work and engage in activities that required like a lot of manual work. And so I used a lot of like culinary therapy to get through the writing of the book. And so if I had spent like quite a bit of time working on an essay that was like emotionally grueling, afterward, what I would do was just commit myself to some like really highly detailed, kind of arduous task in the kitchen. And so I spent like a lot of time baking, because following recipes and working with my hands returned me to my body. And so I got really, really good at baking pies.
I know.
And-
I had one of those pies. I had a slice of that.
Right.
It was really good. Yeah.
And I also perfected my tortillas. I made a lot of tortillas. So I would just be like hours just making them. And so I got really good at making, of course, corn, like the region that we're from in Mexico is a corn region. And then I did try flour. Like I've made flour tortillas, but my flour tortillas have a very long way to go. The tortilla is a deceptively simple object, but it contains multitudes. Like it.
Can you see like also like ancestors being like, you're not doing this? You're not making a flour tortilla? Like I can, like whenever
Yeah.
I've tried to like do versions of things like, you know, without meat, right? Like versions of Palestinian or Egyptian dishes.
Yeah.
It's always failed. And I'm like, there's something going on
Yeah.
with some sort of ancestor who like doesn't want this, like
Yes.
who's like interfering.
Yeah. I wanted, so a lot of the foods that I made were intended to satisfy ancestral appetites. And so I was making food that I knew that my ancestors appreciated and enjoyed. And then I was even at times like relying on their recipes. So I was cooking them the food that they had developed. And yeah, like my family's not from northern Mexico, so the flour tortilla is not like a type of tortilla that we're accustomed to eating. But I do also, I had, so 3 of my grandparents are Mexican and one of my grandparents was Polish American. So I even cooked for him too. I was like, cause he was like a big peach pie enthusiast. So I made peach pie for my white grandfather.
Amazing.
Yeah.
That's so
And
great.
I also made him pierogi. Like, so I was very deliberate about the food I was making and for whom. Yeah.
Pierogies are
But
so
to
amazing.
like feed my spirits. And then the other thing that I was also doing was I was constantly caffeinating them because I want them caffeinated. I want them awake. So
like, I need you to talk to me. Let's keep going.
exactly. So every morning there's an espresso on the altar. Here you go. I'm ready to talk. Yeah.
Do you have an espresso machine or do you make it? How do you do it?
I make it on the stove. Yeah.
That is
Yeah, I do it
so, that's
Yeah.
also very, So on the, with a mocha? Do you use like one of those? Yeah. Those are awesome.
Yeah, because I want to show them like I'm taking this care to make it for you in this old-fashioned way that is familiar to you. So yeah. So there's a lot of care.
I love
ahead.
that. No, I was thinking about how, we don't really talk enough about how difficult it can be, to write about what you've written about, and to write about abuse, and to like really go into those depths, and how long it takes. It takes such a long time to
Yeah,
actually, because who wants to do that? Who wants to go back there, right?
exactly.
Um, but yeah, I know a lot of people who have asked, like, I want to write about this too, but it makes me very emotional, or it's very scary for me, or, and it's very hard to sort of give them an answer or an easy way to do it, because it's like, not, it's true, it's not fun.
Yeah.
Um, it's really
I get
not.
asked
Yeah.
those sorts of questions a lot. Like, I'm interested in writing about or exploring um, some aspect of trauma, but I want to be insulated when I do it. So, how do I insulate myself? And I tell people, you are going to wound yourself when you do it. So, there is only so much insulation that you can create for yourself, because not only do you have to return to those old wounds, there is a pretty high likelihood that you're going to create new ones through the process of the excavation and through the research. Like, people, for example, would ask me when Mean was published, was writing this book about, sexual assault a cathartic experience for you? And I feel like the implication is that the writer is a vessel, and that pain rests inside of the writer. And then when she narrates that pain, it exits her, and now she's an empty, happy vessel. And that's not the way art making functions. And more importantly, catharsis is not intended for the artist. Catharsis is intended for the audience, historically speaking. And at some point, I think during the 20th century, those roles were reversed. And suddenly we are like burdening the artist with the pursuit of catharsis, and using that as a metric to determine whether or not the artist is up to the task. And I can now tell people, I can answer people very honestly, like, the experience was absolutely not cathartic for multiple reasons. One being that I was surviving domestic violence as I was working on that memoir. And so when I worked on that memoir, that manuscript was a place where I hid from my abuser, because he couldn't chase me in there, right? He could chase me around the house, but he couldn't chase me into a manuscript. And so I hid from him, but that's not catharsis. There's a difference between a cocoon and catharsis. And so the manuscript functioned as a cocoon. And then the other thing that I explained to people is that when I was working on Mean, I entered into, digital criminal legal archives, and read a lot of documents regarding what, my perpetrator, Tommy Jesse Martinez, had done. And I was exposed to horrific new details, because I had distanced myself from learning anything else about the other victims he had harmed. But in order to create a complete picture, I had to get a sense of what had happened to the other victims. And learning the scope and scale of his violence, it fucked with me. And it worsened my PTSD. And so there's this myth that sort of like descending into these catacombs is going to purge you. And it just doesn't. It really doesn't.
Yeah.
I tell people, so what I will do is I will like share with people like the techniques that I use to insulate myself, and the techniques that I use to comfort myself. Like, I'll tell people, for example, about like the culinary therapy that I used in terms of like all the cooking and stuff. But it can only go so far. It only goes so. There will be a wound, and so you need to prepare yourself for that wound.
Yeah. There's no shortcut. There's no like magical way. I think,
like, I always imagine people are like, okay, like they're wanting me to explain how they can swaddle themselves in bubble wrap. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And it's like, no, you can't wrap yourself in bubble wrap and then be okay. Like you're gonna get fucked.
Yeah, exactly. And I feel like I also get it. I've also gotten questions from people being like, well, I want to, but I know how fucked I will get once I start writing about it. So I'm preferring not to. So what are some ways to get me to start? And I'm like, you're honestly, the only way is to be like, okay, if I write about this, it might help someone else. If I write about this and it gets out, it might help someone else. That's really the only way to do it, is to like kind
Yes.
of, you are physically going to go in, so you have to take care of yourself, right? But also just thinking ahead, like where
Mhm.
is this narrative going to go? Who's going to hold it? Who's going to, how's it going to affect people?
Exactly.
Who will it help? Like, I think that's really one of the only ways.
And that's future oriented writing.
Yes.
And what astounds me is how often I talk to people who write who are not future oriented about what they're creating. Like, how is this going to live on? How is this going to be received 1 year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and by whom? And so I like I mentioned earlier, when I began to conceive of the book Creep, I was thinking about future survivors and the millions of women and other folks who are going to be experiencing what I've experienced, and how seeing themselves on the page might enable them to then language what is happening to them, right? Because I had an absence of language or an inability to access certain language. And so I'm offering a way of speaking about experience to people who are having parallel experiences. And so I think that, that like that future oriented thinking, and also that future oriented thinking couched in compassion, is what can spur like a person who wants to write about these subjects toward action. But I think without that, there's inertia.
Perfectly said. Yeah. There's a very loud ice cream truck. I don't know if you can hear it, but it's going past my street.
I started to hear a little bit of music and I was like, what's happening?
Yeah, it's the ice cream truck. It's relentless. It really just loves our street, and I don't understand why.
Is it a creepy ice cream truck with like kind of creepy music? Because I remember some of the ice cream trucks, like I remember the ice cream trucks in Highland Park. There was one that was like creepy clown ice cream truck. I was like, that's the scary ice cream truck.
This one isn't, honestly. This one's not a creepy clown one. I know the ones you're talking about, but this one's just extremely loud. It's just like it asserts itself very, very loudly. So apologies.
Oh my God, that's hysterical.
It's getting louder. It's getting closer. I feel like it entered the house.
That's so funny. It doesn't want anybody to miss out. It doesn't want anybody. Like
it's insistent.
Talk about externalizing one's interiority.
Yes. Exactly. I love that. I love that you externalize your interiority. It's one of the reasons I like being your friend.
Oh, thank you, Randa.
Yeah, I'm like, yes, let us talk about these things. Yeah. What are you working on? Not that you have to be working on anything new, but what are you like working on now, other than the tour, which sounds like it's been really, really extensive? Yeah.
So I've got a couple of things going on. I'm working on like a long essay about a small town that's directly north of the town where I grew up. So I grew up in the town of Santa Maria, and north of Santa Maria is the town of Nipomo. And I'm fascinated by Nipomo for various reasons, but Nipomo has like Nipomo was like this really fond place that we went to during my childhood, because it was where we would go to chop down our Christmas tree. So we would go to a Christmas tree farm and we would choose the tree, and then we would each take turns with the saw or the axe, chopping down the tree, and then we would bring it home and trim the tree. So I loved that annual excursion because, you know, I got to handle an axe, you know what I mean? It was like, what other time do children get to handle axes?
Amazing.
So I loved Nipomo for that reason. And I also admired the photography of Dorothea Lange. Like, she was one of the first photographers whose images really hooked me. And when I was a kid, I would go hang out in my dad's office sometime. My dad worked as a school administrator. He was first a teacher and later an administrator. And he was the director of the migrant education program. And he had a photo in his office that was Dorothea Lange image, Migrant Mother, which is one of the most iconic images in U.S. history, right? Of a woman who has traveled from Oklahoma to California seeking agricultural labor. That photo was taken in Nipomo, and I didn't know that for the longest time. And it was actually taken about half a mile from the Christmas tree farm that I would go to.
That's wild.
And so I'm writing an essay about my family's relationship to California, to that region of California, and to farm workers specifically, and our relationship to this iconic image. And I'm gonna sort of begin at the Christmas tree farm. That's like my point of entry.
I love it. With the axe? I can see
With an
it with
axe,
the
yes.
axe. Like, give everyone give not everyone access, but you know,
But give some of us access.
give queer women access for sure. That would be incredible. An axe for us all. Yeah. That's great. I love that. I'm excited about it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And then I also have other ideas, like for stuff I'd like to work on. Like, I'd like to return to fiction. And I also have another idea for a nonfiction book explicitly about true crime, like a critique of true crime.
Oh, wow. I love that. That's great.
And of course, I have to implicate myself because some of what I have written has been classified within that genre. So
yeah.
Yeah.
But I would love to see like implications of Capote and sort of all of that. Yeah.
And then attempting to answer the question, like, is it possible to create ethical true crime? Because there are people who are making that attempt. So yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
That's going to be juicy. That's going to be very juicy to get into and like think about and explore and sort of research.
I'm excited about it.
Yeah. And also the way that it exists outside of American culture, you know?
And I want to take an international approach. And so I'm not going to start with true crime in the US. I'm actually going to start with true crime in Mexico. Because one of my grandmothers was obsessed, like she was fanatic about true crime. And true crime in Mexico does not resemble true crime in the United States. It's much, much, much more graphic and explicit. Like, I remember hearing my dad describe, you know, having found some of my grandmother's true crime magazines when he was a kid, and he recalls one of the covers, which was a recreation of a crime scene where a man had murdered his wife. He'd chopped her up with a machete, and he was covered in blood. The photographers had gone to the police station where the man was being held and had him recreate the scene so that they could get a shot. Like,
that's wild.
Yes.
Oh my God.
Yes. So true crime in Mexico is different than it is in the United States. So I want to take an international approach to it as opposed to like an explicitly American approach. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. There's really cool shit in Egypt too, just so you know, like same thing with Egyptian tabloids. There's so many just really gory
Yes.
photo spreads. You know, true crime is
Yeah,
like
it's
such a
heavy
huge
on the
thing there.
gore.
Yeah, it's so gory. I just grew up with seeing all that gore. There
Mhm.
was like a story about two sisters who would kidnap people and murder them for their gold. So they would, they would target people in the markets and in the streets that seemed to be wealthy, lure them back to their apartment, murder them, and then try to bury them in their basement and sell their gold. And when I was a kid, I saw a musical about this. So, like that's the route Egyptians take. They're like, okay, let's
Right?
take this gory story and like make it a musical. Mental,
Yeah,
and it's
like
on YouTube. So
yeah, I remember that there was a tabloid story circulating regarding a sack of heads that had been deposited out near this opera house in Guadalajara, and I remember family members arguing about how many heads. Like that was the concern, was like people were getting the number of heads wrong. Not that
that's
people had been
incredible.
decapitated, but was it 9 heads or 12 heads? You know what I mean? Like that.
I love the fact checking. The fact checking is like the best. It's like, no, let's not talk about like the ethical situation,
No,
the
let's talk
sadness.
about the number of heads.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's wild.
Yeah,
A
one of my
sack of
uncles
heads.
was really angry that the number of heads had been misreported.
Yeah, it's like only 12. There were at least 16 heads in that sack.
Exactly. And they'll show it like in the crime magazines. Like they'll show the heads. They'll line them up.
Yeah,
And it's just
yeah.
like and it's like and especially as a child when you see these things, like you're making eye contact with decapitated heads on the page, but it's still eye contact with the
It's
head.
terrifying.
You know what I mean? It's like,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah. That reminds me of that scene where I think it's Ramirez's uncle has like all these heads that he's
Head.
brought back with him, these shrunken heads that he just kind of stares at really, really, really closely before he goes
Mhm.
to bed, and just how
Yeah. And my uncle Henry, he would tell, because he went to Vietnam. He was a Chicano who went to Vietnam, and he would tell stories about people he had served with bringing back trophies. That a lot of
yeah,
GIs that he served with brought back ears, and they were allowed to
yeah,
bring them back, and they would bring back necklaces basically of ears.
yeah, yeah. Just the ways that um empire encourages this
Trophy
kind of
keeping.
just serial killing. Like
Mhm.
it's
And I
just
think,
code,
like,
it's
the
built
keeping
in.
of these relics, I feel like the keeping of these human relics represents, for those who are involved in these imperial projects, a triumph over death. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. And also some sort of like weirdly, like some sort of like what's the word? Like uh not justification, but some sort of record of the horror that happened
Yeah.
too, right? Like
Yeah.
this way it was real, right?
Yeah. I also think that there's, like, spiritual domination,
Oh
implicated
yeah.
in those sorts of practices, because every culture has its own mortuary and funerary practices, and every culture has its beliefs about what happens to the spirit in the afterlife. And so often there is like this requisite process through which the body has to pass in order for the spirit to achieve peace. And the trophy keeping disrupts that. And so I think it's an attempt to continue to dominate the person in their afterlife too.
Yeah. I
Ugh.
agree. Yeah, that
Ugh.
totally makes
It's
sense.
like,
Yeah. Yeah. It's so creepy.
mhm.
Um Yeah, and I agree. It is. It's definitely a kind of violence, a spiritual violence that gets a pass, you know?
Because it's
Yeah.
patriotic.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I still don't think like I think the Abu Ghraib sort of the leak of those photos and of that violence, um, I don't know, like the fact that it didn't stop the sort of like the colonial project of war, right? It just yeah, it's just like a snapshot of it, really.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's all breathe.
Exhaling colonialism.
Oh, okay.
It can exit us now. Yeah.
Thank you, Randa. You are
Yay. You are the best.
the
I'm so excited about you writing fiction too. Like, I used to assign your collection, um,
Oh,
and students love it. Like, yeah, your fiction's great. I'd love to read more of
thank
it.
you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have this idea for a collection. Like the working title is Smoke. And like the through lines are only going to be like in terms of character and motif. And so I want to populate the collection entirely with Latina characters who all have some type of relationship with marijuana.
I love that.
So I'm like
I'm like,
super excited. Yeah, I know. Like I've lived a life in preparation for this.
that's so great. I feel like that should be the opening line, That's so good. Yes. I have done the research since the age of
Right?
14 or
Thorough fucking
whatever.
research.
Thorough.
I mean, we
Yeah.
may have researched together.
Yeah, I think we have in the past. Yes. Yeah. And it's like just the political like aspects of weed and
Like
the ways that, who gets punished for it and who doesn't.
racialized
And
weed. Like I've just seen so much of it, especially having been a teacher. Like I've seen who gets a pass and who gets their ass beat. You know what I mean? So
oh yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. As a parent too, just seeing my kid get caught over and over and being like, you're brown, you're gonna get caught. Like, this is not the way to go.
Yeah. No, I'm so excited to like cultivate my inner Cheech and my inner Chong. Like I just
Yeah, are you holding a lighter right now?
No, it looks like a lighter, but it's my baby lip.
Okay,
I'm
perfect.
addicted to this. Like I keep promoting it like
It's
on
so
various
good.
podcasts. I always have it in my hand. I should be sponsored by them. It's Maybelline.
Yeah, you're like, maybe she's born with it. I used to buy those because the first time I bought it, I thought that it was the color. Like they came in these colors.
Yeah.
But then I like started using it, was like, oh my God, this is so good. It actually hydrates.
Exactly. And it's the
Yeah.
only one that's like that. Like so many of the other ones just coat, but they don't hydrate.
Yeah, they don't actually penetrate.
Yeah,
Yes.
or they kick really badly, and I hate it when the mat turns to just
Wax.
crust.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's gross.
So, and this doesn't do that. I'm so a spokesperson for this.
Yeah. I'm seeing your bank account. It's just like Maybelline, Maybelline, coming, incoming payments. Maybelline.
I'm available, Maybelline.
Maybelline, if you want a critique of true crime, let's go. Let's sponsor the next one. Let's sponsor Myriam's next book immediately.
Yeah, that's hysterical. No, but I do have a lighter like right over there. Like there's here. Let me show you my lighter.
Yes, please.
So I can totally see why.
See, I thought it was
identified it as such, right? Because it's like
it's very similar. Yeah.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Look at that. I'm like, yes, we are at a concert.
Right?
Yes,
Oh my God.
100%.
When I used to be a high school teacher and we would have like a deep moment in class, the kids would find the lighter app and then they would hold it up in the air and start doing this. It was the funniest fucking thing ever. They
That's
just all started,
beautiful.
oh my God, you guys are hysterical.
Do you ever miss teaching or?
I totally miss teaching. I do not miss administrators, but I miss teaching a ton. And I see I like find students all over the place. Cause like, I mean, every year I would teach somewhere around like 180 kids and then multiply that by like 15. That's a lot of people who have like traveled through my classroom. And so what was funny was like when I started the tour, I had to go to LAX to fly out to New York. And as I'm like checking in my bags, I hear Gurba. And I'm like, oh God. And I turn around and there's a kid that I've taught. You know what I mean? And then at various readings that I did, kids I taught showed up and they were like buying the book and like hanging out. And I was so thrilled. And like
I love that.
always have my students in mind when I write. I'm always like, what if a former student or a future student comes to the work? Like, and so they're always part of like my imagined audience.
I can tell. I can see it, right? Like you do bring this like definitely like fierce post-colonial educator energy,
Thank
just
you.
liberating energy to your writing. And I think that, yeah, I can tell. I'm like, wow, this person is immersed in a sort of anti-colonial teaching tradition. And it's hard. It's hard work. It can be very, very taxing. Speaking of like
Totally.
going into, the sadness or the wounds. Yeah, it's not a joke. Like being a secondary teacher, that particular level can be so exhausting. So
Definitely. Yeah. It's so fun to see them as grown-ups. You know what I mean? Like I remember I went to a restaurant once and the server was one of my former students, right? But he's like all grown up now. He had this big mustache. He was all tall. And I had known him when he was like tiny. He was like he was like the most petite kid. And he's trying to be like a man now, right? Like, and being like just really macho and stuff. And I was cracking up because he had been the class clown when I had known him. And I think part of his class clownishness was like to compensate for his petiteness, because he was such a petite kid. And I just remember the funniest thing that he said. There were a bunch of kids and they were having a conversation amongst themselves, right? And they were talking about their history class. And so they're talking about history. And then the kids were asking one another, what US historical figure would you want to make out with? And it has to be somebody dead, right? So the kids were all like naming like basically historical hotties that they wanted to make out with. And so then somebody asked this boy, they're like, what about you? And this kid didn't miss a fucking beat. He turns around and he goes, Sacco and Vanzetti, 3-way. It's just so fucking.
That's beautiful. That's awesome.
Isn't it?
What a great moment.
3-way.
3-way. I'd be so proud as an educator. I'd be like, yes, you have understood the assignments, my child. Because it is a kind of parenting.
I was so dead. I was like, oh my God.
That's amazing. Yeah. I also feel like that kind of like teaching it's so parental too. Like you are definitely parenting them. They're with you for hours and hours, right? Like
exactly. I remember there was another kid in my class. He was having a conversation with his friends. And one of the friends had described like another dude as being like handsome or good looking. And then, oopsie, we lost Randa. Uh-oh, where did Randa go?
I don't know. Maybe her internet went out.
Huh?
Maybe her internet went out briefly. I'm not
She
sure.
did, yeah. She'll be back.
Well, finish telling your story.
Okay. Oh, here she is.
Here
She's
you go.
back.
Sorry, I don't know what happened. It just maybe it did cut out. Maybe it did cut out. Yes. Okay.
Oh, so there's these kids, right? These boys, like 4 or 5 boys. They're all like Mexican American or Central American, and they're talking about like, and one boy had mentioned like that some other dude was good looking, and then these other boys were like, "What? That's gay." Da, 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 da. And then I was like, "It's not gay to say that like another man is handsome. You're just admiring aesthetics." So I gave them like this little lecture about aesthetics, right? And so then one of the boys was like, "Okay, so it's okay if I think guys are handsome?" And then I was like, "Yeah, like it's undeniable. Like if somebody's good looking, somebody's good looking. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have a sexual or romantic attraction. You can just have aesthetic admiration."
You
And
blew their
then
minds.
then one of his classmates goes to him. He goes, "Well, who do you find good looking?" And so the boy sat there for like a whole minute, like thinking like, okay, who's a good looking man? And then suddenly the boy goes, "Cool Hand Luke." And it was such like, we were not expecting Paul Newman to come out of this little cholo's mouth. I was like, Paul fucking Newman.
That's
dang,
wild.
High five. Like, it was just such like out of the fucking blue.
I mean, facts.
Right?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And it was so funny because like the other kids were all nodding too. And they had taken a film analysis class where they had watched Cool Hand Luke. And so that's how they knew who Paul Newman was. And I was like, I need to tell your teacher that she's doing a fucking good job.
That's a really good job. Seriously, for high school students, that's a good one. Yeah,
and
that's
I love
really
that
good.
he didn't say Paul Newman. He said Cool Hand Luke.
Cool Hand Luke. He's like, I don't find the actor attractive. I find the character attractive.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. It's so real. That's great. You taught them. Yeah, that was like such a good lesson for them to learn, you know, like,
Thank you.
oh, you can just find someone attractive. Yeah.
It's like
and not
painting.
actually be attracted to them.
Like, it doesn't mean you want to date the painting. It's just, you know, it's aesthetically pleasing to you.
Exactly.
And Cool Hand Luke was a badass. Yes, this is true.
Yeah, facts. But mostly Paul Newman. I mean, there's that new documentary where it's like revealed that Paul Newman was never really a good actor, but he just was at the right place at the right time and was like incredibly good looking.
It's so much of it is the jawline, I think.
Yeah.
I think 50% of it is the jawline.
50% the jawline, the other 50% like this, like the eyes and the brow.
Nice too, yeah.
Yeah. 100%, right?
Yeah. But yeah, he's definitely a historical hottie now.
Historical hotties unite.
I love the phrase historical hottie.
Historical hotties only.
Right? Isn't there like a Twitter account, historical hotties, and they post like
probably
new dead hottie like every day or something?
Yes, probably and possibly. That sounds great. I need to join them, even though what's your
fantasizing this? I hope somebody creates one.
Yeah, let's put it out into the ether, basically. Like, make it happen.
Just like my Maybelline sponsorship.
Exactly, all of it. Let's do it all. Speaking of Twitter, what's your relationship with Twitter these days?
I mean, I look at it because I just want to see what's happening. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But like, it's so pared down now. It's so beleaguered.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the fascists are doing a really good job of shredding it.
Yeah, they really are.
And like, people keep sounding the death knell, but I think that what's going to happen is that like it's going to morph into something kind of like MySpace, where like it's going to exist as a website, but like with tumbleweeds blowing through it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, kind of like Threads.
Yeah. Yeah. Or like it's going to become what Parler had intended to be, but then Parler also tanked.
Yeah.
Because fascists just aren't that good at social media. Because they're not.
Yeah, and also if they shut everyone else down, right? Like, what are they?
Who are they going to have to bait?
Who are they going to bait? Who are they going to attack? You know, who are they going to critique? Yeah.
Yeah, so like I'll go on it, but there's like minimal engagement on it these days.
Yeah, I feel that way too. And I was like, what's going on over there? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, maybe we're hearing its death rattle.
Yeah. I mainly like just have like some of, you know, my friends on the list. So I'll just keep up to date to what you guys are up to and just be like, oh, okay, this is what's happening.
Yeah.
And then I know who of my friends has me on a list, because I'll tweet something like, my neck hurts from eating too much pussy, and someone will message me immediately and be like,
neck remedy.
Does your neck really hurt? Is it really your neck that, like, are you okay? Do you need a ride to the airport or to the hospital? I'm like, no, I'm fine. It's truly okay.
That's hysterical.
Yeah. This has been lovely. I'm going to engage in some culinary therapy of my own. I'm gonna be making dinner.
What are you gonna make?
I think I'm gonna make I have hummus and I have chicken. So I think I'm gonna make like shawarma on the grill.
Ooh, delicious.
Yeah. Maybe some garlic sauce.
I love garlic.
I think that would be tasty. But
good.
Yeah. This has been really fun. What?
I'm gonna have somebody cook for me.
Ooh, I love it. Yeah. That's what you deserve, truly.
Thank you.
Just rest now. Just rest and have someone cook for you. And I can't wait to see you. And yeah, one of the things, like, I love this combo, but it's also public. So
yeah,
there's so much shit. There's so much chisme. There's chisme. There's all sorts of things.
We need to catch up. We
need to catch up. Yeah. But yeah, thank you so much all for joining us. Full bookstore. Yeah. I don't know if you wanted to say anything else. Or Myriam?
This was such an honor. I love Kara's books. I love you, Randa, and I want to thank everybody for their graciousness. Thank you so much.
Yay. Buy this book. Buy this. Read it. You will love it.
So
that's so weird to see like the me's across the screen. I feel like I need to...
Yeah, there you go.
It's one click at the bottom of the screen to buy Creep directly from Karis. It really does help us when you buy your event books from us. So click that teal button and make it happen. It also is really great to request it from your public library. So let your local librarian know that you would like them to carry this book. We hear time and time again from librarians that it is helpful to them when you request books. It is not imposition. It is actually a thing that they want you to do. So don't be shy. You can also read Randa's books, which are all available from Karis. You can read Myriam's backlist, which is available from Karis. And we would love for you to do that. And this event, we'll put if there's folks who should have been here tonight who weren't here, let them know it'll be up on Karis's YouTube channel in a couple days so they can watch the replay. And any other events you have coming up that you want to shout out, Myriam or Randa? Anything that you guys have coming up that you're like, hey, watch this or come see me somewhere?
I've got an in-store event at Octavia's Books in Pasadena, and I also have an in-store event in Long Beach at Page Against the Machine. Yeah, so cool. I've got those two coming up.
Yeah.
Randa, you want to shout out?
I will try to go to your Octavia's event. But yeah,
take a photo for the internet so that we can see.
That'll be beautiful. Yes, we shall.
Thank you
for hosting us.
Thank you
we
so much.
all so
Have a
much.
good night, everybody.
Care. Thank you.
Bye.